What's the real job of an FBI profiler like? What's it like to be a detective or a federal prosecutor, or to make it your mission to catch the serial killer who killed your cousin? What's it like to be the father of a missing and murdered Indigenous woman? At the Silver Linings Handbook podcast, we explore conversations that inspire with people from all walks of life. I'm Jason Blair, the host. Come join us for these interesting conversations wherever you get your podcasts.
This week, I went back to the year 1934, and boy, did I ever find a bad guy. This bank robber's short and brutal crime spree across the American Midwest would establish him as a folk hero in a nation disillusioned by the Great Depression. While he was among many celebrity outlaws of the time, he was the first to be branded public enemy number one by the agency that would soon after don the letters FBI. Stick around as I tell you all about a guy named John Dillinger on this episode of Vintage Villains. Well, hello there, friends. Welcome to Vintage Villains. I am Allison Dixon, and it is great to be back to business following the three-part series I just wrapped up with my buddy Jason Blair on the Oklahoma Girl Scout murders of 1977. And speaking of FBI, episode 3 of that series featured a former FBI profiler, Julia Cowley of the Consult podcast. I highly recommend you check out that show. And now, as we turn back to a run of solo episodes over the next several weeks, I wanted to go further back in time to one of my favorite periods of history, the Prohibition and Great Depression eras of the U.S., which overlap and encompass all of the 1920s up through the late 1930s. And John Dillinger in particular holds a special bit of significance for me. For those listening who don't know what all I do with my life outside this show, I'm a fiction writer. And about a decade ago, I wrote a short story called John Dillinger and the Blind Magician, which was eventually published in Apex magazine. In it, I took part of the story you're about to hear over the next several weeks, particularly from the night Dillinger died, and retold it through the lens of fantasy and magic. I was always pretty proud of that story, even though it admittedly fell into a very narrow niche, some mishmash of historical fiction and contemporary fantasy. And I didn't think many would get it, even if the editor at that magazine ultimately did. But then in 2022, I received an email from the producer of a podcast called LEVAR Burton Reads. Yes, that LeVar Burton of Reading Rainbow and Star Trek: The Next Generation. On his podcast, he likes to narrate some of his favorite short stories he encounters out in the wild. And it just so happened he stumbled across that 2015 copy of Apex, read John Dillinger and the Blind Magician, and loved it enough that he wanted to read it for his show. After picking my jaw up off the floor several times and then just opting to leave it there, in fact, it's still there, I of course said yes. A few weeks later, the episode aired, complete with sound effects and music and Burton's stunning narration that would make even a grocery list sound compelling. If you're interested in checking it out, I'll have a link in the show notes. And definitely wait until after you finish listening to this episode, because the story plays particularly well for those who have some working knowledge of Dillinger. But before I get to him, you know what we have to do. We have to call up the old Zeitgeist Zeppelin and make our scheduled departure for the year John Dillinger met his maker, 1934. The height of the Great Depression. Now, there were a lot of bad guys doing bad guy things all over the country around this time, much of it driven by a pervasive sense of hopelessness and anger stemming from the stock market crash of 1929 that happened in October, known as Black Tuesday. Although many historians accurately point out that the signs of a looming economic collapse were there well before then, Black Tuesday ended up being the stake through the heart, and its effects were global. International trade fell by more than half, as did the American GDP. Unemployment rose as high as 25% here, and in other countries went as high as 33%. Crop prices fell by 60%. Construction projects all over the world halted, and of course, we've all heard stories of the breadlines. And one important factoid to keep in mind as we study the moves and machinations of this famous bank robber: no one trusted financial institutions anymore, especially working class folks. They stopped storing their money in them and no longer wanted to take out loans. There was no FDIC back in these days, at least before the Depression. When the banks failed, it took everyone's fortunes down with them. So as we begin the Zeitgeist Zeppelin's ascent to examine the cultural events, try to keep all this stuff in mind. The Great Depression cast a long shadow, not only over the US, but the entire world. I also figured I'd run off a few basic cost of living items for 1934. And I actually plan to do this for all the years going forward because it's been requested. And who am I but to, deny anybody what they want, at least for this show. Now let's start with the cost of gas. Since most folks were driving automobiles by this point, you could have a gallon of it for 19 cents, which is $2.71 adjusted for inflation, and not too far off from what I paid the other day when I filled up. Oil ran at $1 a barrel, or $14 around that today. A house, now if you wanted to buy one of those, it would run you a cool 3,900 buckaroonies, and you could now get yourself a fair mortgage from a bank insured by the government, thanks to the shiny new Federal Housing Authority, the FHA, and that FDIC I mentioned a moment ago, thanks to FDR's New Deal legislation. The average yearly income in 1934 was $1,730, or the equivalent of around 39 grand today. A dozen eggs would run you 33 cents, which is around $6 today, and again, not too far off from what we're seeing at the local Kroger. Milk, now that was a bit pricier. It was typically sold in half gallons in those days, and it ran 22 cents, which was the equivalent of about $4.27, or if you think about a gallon, that's nearly $9. A car, now a new Ford V8 would run you around $515, or the equivalent of 12 grand, or you could pick up a used Chevy Roadster for around $225. But not all these things applied to all citizens. Just ask anyone who was sent to Alcatraz Island after January 1st, since that was the day the former military fort and jail in San Francisco Bay opened its gates as a federal prison. Among its most famous residents, Al Capone, George Machine Gun Kelly, and Robert Stroud, who you may know better as the Birdman of Alcatraz. I have plans to talk more about this prison in a future episode. It's always been a source of fascination for me. The first day of 34 was also momentous over in Germany, because that's when the Nazi Party passed the Law for the Prevention of Genetically Diseased Offspring, which ensured the compulsory sterilization of anyone believed to have a supposed genetic disorder. As a result of this law, over 400,000 people were sterilized against their will during the Nazi regime. And this jump into hardcore eugenics, which in fact they learned from us here in America, but I'm getting off track there, was only the beginning of a very industrious year for the Nazis, as you'll soon see. The next day, Pennsylvania became the first state to open liquor stores again after the long, dry 13-year stretch without American booze production, at least the legal kind, known as Prohibition. And that helped give rise to a massive black market in bootlegged alcohol and established many well-known gangsters and criminals of this era, the aforementioned Al Capone being only one. And maybe if you were interested in doing a little reading while sipping a legal cocktail, you might have noticed a Flash Gordon comic strip, which debuted on January 7th. At the end of the month, Hitler was growing industrious yet again. On the first anniversary of his appointment as Chancellor, the Reichstag passed the law on the reconstruction of the Reich, which transferred the sovereignty of the states to the federal government and dissolved the state parliaments, which makes me feel a little terrified just thinking about. Something similar was happening next door in Austria as well, as the next day, Chancellor Engelbert Dollfuss outlawed all political parties but his own, the right-wing Fatherland Front. This sparked a 4-day uprising some refer to as the Austrian Civil War, where socialists and authoritarian groups clashed across the country. Ultimately, the fascists won. Similar fights were also happening in France and other countries as well. World War II was still a few years off, but a quick study of this year in particular shows a lot of the foundations being laid. And again, a lot of this was colored by the global fallout of the Great Depression. And the dominoes fell very hard in Europe, and Germany in particular. History provides countless examples, unfortunately, of how economic disparity gives rise to authoritarianism, whose message of reestablishing order is difficult to resist for people who've been battered by losing everything. Meanwhile, in the States, where we were doing our own take on the whole reestablishment of order thing, you might have gone to see a movie or two. One of them could have been It Happened One Night, directed by the legendary Frank Capra of It's a Wonderful Life and Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, although this one starred Clark Gable rather than Jimmy Stewart. This was also the year the Academy Award Gold Statuette was first referred to as Oscar in print. No one can confirm exactly why they started calling it that, though many theories abound. One of which is that actress Bette Davis claimed the statue looked like her uncle Oscar, and there hasn't really been another theory that sounds more convincing, so I'll go with it. Or perhaps you were into stars of a different variety and found yourself gazing at the now famous photograph taken by astronomer Edwin Hubble, namesake of the space telescope we all know and love. And it showed as many galaxies in our night sky as there are individual stars, and it's still mind-blowing to look at. Go Google that thing, would you? And in other matters of the sky, at the end of 1934, aviator Wiley Post would climb to an altitude of 50,000 feet in his aeroplane and discover the wind current we now know as the jet stream. But there was still a lot of riffraff running around here on the ground. While John Dillinger and his gang were doing their best to outsmart the nation's lawmen, another famous bank-robbing power couple, Bonnie and Clyde, were also still at large and dominating the newspapers. On April 1st, they would kill 2 young highway patrolmen, H.D. Murphy and Edward Bryant Wheeler, in Grapevine, Texas. While many of these gangs had attained some level of hero status among the people, murders like this would quickly turn the perception against them. It's all fun and games until innocent folks start dying. Bonnie and Clyde, meanwhile, they would die later the following month in a police ambush down in Louisiana. And yeah, I'll probably do an episode on those 2 crazy kids at some point, though I can say they were no Warren Beatty and Faye Dunaway. Meanwhile, spring was continuing to bear ominous fruit for fascism over in Europe as Hitler appointed Heinrich Himmler chief of all German police, including their super scary secret police. And here's an item that seems completely unrelated, but in baseball, on April 21st, Washington Senators catcher Mo Berg would play an American League record 117 consecutive errorless games. Now, Mo, he was a very interesting guy. While also an excellent baseball player, he was a linguistics major in college and spoke 7 languages. When World War II broke out, he would actually go on to become a spy for the precursor to the Central Intelligence Agency. There's actually a book about this called The Catcher is a Spy. One of his assignments was to spend some time in Germany observing the work of a scientist named Werner Heisenberg, who you probably have heard of if you have watched any of Breaking Bad. And he'd been at work developing an atomic bomb for the Nazis. Berg, meanwhile, was under orders to kill Heisenberg if it looked like his plans were coming together. But ironically, Heisenberg's research would hit a dead end because while Hitler was interested in having such a bomb, he actually wanted to drop it on New York City, he didn't trust the Jewish scientists who were doing most of the work at the time. As we know, Robert Oppenheimer and his team would successfully develop the bomb for the US, and Moe Berg ended up becoming a key player in the Manhattan Project. But back to 1934. In May, Trans World Airlines, TWA, began commercial service. I used to fly TWA all the time back in the day, actually, but they would become a casualty of the September 11th attacks of 2001, and they were mostly gone after 2003. May is also when you would have read headlines about the Battle of Toledo, a massive auto worker strike that devolved into a 5-day-long melee between 1,300 troops of the Ohio National Guard and 6,000 picketers demanding better pay and working conditions. And amid all the economic upheavals and labor disputes going on, if your family was in a good enough place to take a summer vacation after July 15th, you'd be able to visit the newly dedicated Great Smoky Mountains National Park, which sits majestically on the border between North Carolina and eastern Tennessee. If you haven't had the pleasure of making that drive, my friends, do yourself that solid. It is one of the prettiest places in the USA, if I do say so. Also in July, on the 4th to be precise, Hungarian physicist Leo Szilard patented the idea for a nuclear fission reactor. Szilard would also go on to become one of the forebears of the Manhattan Project. On the very same day, two-time Nobel Prize winner and the first woman to win one at all, Marie Curie, died of aplastic anemia at the age of 66, the result of years of exposure to the elements radium and polonium, which formed the backbone of her work and made her the mother of modern-day physics. Her body was buried in a lead-lined coffin for extra precautions with the radiation, but her belongings and research equipment, which were even more irradiated than she was, she actually did take precautions to protect herself, well, those will need to remain sealed in lead boxes for another 1,500 years before they're considered completely safe to handle. Without the work and sacrifices of Marie and her husband Pierre, we might not have the cancer treatments still in wide use today. Also this summer, Franklin Roosevelt became the first sitting U.S. president to visit South America, Colombia in particular, en route to a vacation in Hawaii. He would also become the first president to travel through the Panama Canal on that same trip. And on August 2nd, German President Paul Hindenburg died of lung cancer at age 86. Hindenburg was in power from 1925 until his death, and is the one who appointed Adolf Hitler as chancellor. And on that day, Hitler would unite the offices of the German chancellor and the president, declaring himself Führer, which means leader in German. In October, he would expand the German army and navy in a direct violation of the Treaty of Versailles, which was signed after World War I. Back here in the States, our autumn would be filled with headlines concerning the arrest and indictment of a man named Bruno Hauptmann for the murder of famous aviator Charles Lindbergh's baby son in 1932. Tuck that one away for another Vintage Villains episode, would ya? And another infamous bank robber, Charles Pretty Boy Floyd, would be shot to death by FBI agents in Ohio. And on November 12th, notorious murderer and cult leader Charles Manson would be born in Cincinnati, Ohio. As a Scorpio who was also born in Ohio, I would like to officially repudiate this event. And in November, yet another famed bank robber, Babyface Nelson, died in a shootout with the feds in Barrington, Illinois. Nelson was a partner of Dillinger's and was known for killing more federal agents than any other person. If you're going to be, you are going to be sticking around, I hope. And if you do, you're going to hear a lot more about that and a lot of these other guys as we bring the Zeitgeist Zeppelin back down to the ground. You know, there's just something about an old-fashioned outlaw that always draws my attention. Mind you, I didn't say anything about envy. If anything, we tend to overly romanticize these people. The lives of most outlaws, especially back in those days, were nothing to aspire to. They were injured and sick a lot and couldn't see any real doctors. They were constantly on the run from police and always had to be prepared for one of their own to get caught and possibly turn snitch to save themselves. When you live outside the bounds of the law, the whole world becomes a hostile place, full of barbs to be snagged on and holes to fall into. I just think it's interesting to ponder the psychology of people who not only refuse to conform to the laws and social contracts most of us agree upon, but do so with such extreme bravado. People like John Dillinger and his gang, or Bonnie and Clyde, they were all too happy to put their lives directly on the line for these wild principles of theirs. And well, they died violently, doing what they loved most, sticking it to the man. Which at the time of the Great Depression especially must have felt like a laudable goal to a lot of the folks watching from the sidelines. John Herbert Dillinger was born in the middle-class Oak Hill suburb of Indianapolis, Indiana, on June 22, 1903, the youngest of two children. His sister Audrey is about 14 years older, so they waited a while to add to the brood. His mother, Molly, passed away just prior to John's 4th birthday from a long illness that ended in a stroke. His father, also named John, but with a different middle name, I'll be calling him John Sr., he was a successful and hardworking grocer, and by all accounts, a soft-spoken and traditional man. In place of his mother, John's sister Audrey helped raise him for a time, though she would soon marry and begin having many children of her own, one of whom, Mary, would become one of John's closest friends and confidants throughout his life. But John Sr. was basically a single dad for a few years. According to many sources, he would often vacillate between being strict or overly permissive. Punishments like spanking with a barrel stave or confining him to the house when he was bad would quickly be followed with him giving Johnny enough money to buy all the candy he wanted or letting him roam the streets from dawn until dusk doing God knows what. It all reads like a man just trying to figure out what to do with a challenging and highly kinetic little boy from one day to the next, the old spaghetti approach of seeing what will stick. In 1912, John Sr. would marry again to a Quaker woman named Lizzie Fields, which would bring a much-needed mother figure back into young Dillinger's life. Though some say the transition was challenging for young Johnny, it appears he would eventually come to love her as his mother. John Sr. and Lizzie would go on to have 3 more children over the next 8 years. Although this was a lot of transition for any young kid to manage, there wasn't any indication of a bad upbringing here. Quite the opposite, I'd say. You're not going to find any comparisons to Ed Gein here. But John's natural inclination was always toward mischief and rule breaking and sometimes even violent behavior, which only worsened as he entered his teens. He was hauled before a juvenile judge on more than one occasion for some of the tricks he pulled, though he didn't get any real punishment for it. He was also a known bully of some of his fellow classmates, targeting smaller kids to gang up on. Eventually, he formed a little neighborhood gang comprised of other young louts, and they called themselves the Dirty Dozen. Of course, they'd run around town, stealing from train cars and raising other forms of small hell. That said, Most of Dillinger's neighbors and teachers remember him as a normal enough boy. Sure, a bit of a troublemaker, but typical for a lot of kids that age. You ever see The Little Rascals? It's kind of the picture that comes to mind. In addition to his energy, he had a lot of charisma, always presented himself very neatly. Some of his teachers reported that his pranks were kind of funny, inventive, which tells me he learned even then the value of charm, something that would serve him quite well later on. At 16, Dillinger decided he was done being the square peg in the round hole at school. He dropped out and took up various odd jobs, finally settling in for a bit at a local machine shop. Though it was a steady gig, John always took long vacations after making a large enough chunk of change. It was impossible to hold him in the same place for too long, and that's a pattern we're going to see throughout his life. John Sr. said his son always had a gift for all things mechanical. Though he wished Johnny would have stayed in school, he was glad the kid seemed able to learn a trade. Only problem was Dillinger never lost his taste for trouble. After his shifts, he would roam the streets at all hours of the night, drinking whiskey, gambling, getting into fights, visiting sex workers. Though it didn't appear his father was aware of these illicit activities at the time, the man no doubt could see his wayward son slipping further away from the straight path. In 1920, he would retire from the grocery life and sell his property in Indianapolis and buy a small farm about 20 miles southwest in Mooresville. He probably also felt the quieter environment would be a positive influence on his 17-year-old son, but young Johnny, well, he had no interest in cloistering himself within the cornfields or helping dad out on the farm. He would take a rail car into Indianapolis to continue work at the machine shop and would eventually upgrade to a motorcycle, thus beginning his lifelong lust for fast and dangerous vehicles. A few years later, in 1924, John decided to try his hand at stealing a car. His skills as a thief, however, had yet to fully mature, and he was caught in a flash. But he fled police as they were attempting to arrest him, and realizing he was finally cornered and in some pretty big trouble, he did what a lot of troubled young men at the time did as a last-ditch effort. He joined the military, in particular the Navy. But he found the rigor and the discipline a terrible fit pretty much right off the bat, and after multiple disciplinary problems, he went AWOL after only 5 months of service. When his ship docked in Boston, he hit the road. A series of months followed with his moves unaccounted for. As far as his family was aware, he was off being a sailor somewhere. But he returned home to Mooresville the following spring, claiming he was honorably discharged after being diagnosed with a heart murmur. He then got hitched to a 17-year-old girl named Beryl Hovius, and after a brief honeymoon period, he would begin gallivanting around the town all night again, leaving his frustrated young wife at home to wonder if he was sleeping around. While it's all but certain he was doing just that, Dillinger's lust for the ladies would be part of his ultimate downfall. He was mainly getting involved in local thuggery. On September 6, 1924, Dillinger and a local pool shark named Ed Singleton concocted a scheme to rob a local grocer named Frank Morgan. Dillinger would do the actual stick-em-up, while Singleton would facilitate the getaway. At least that was the plan. As Morgan walked home with that day's receipts totaling about $120 in his pocket, Dillinger accosted him on the street, striking Morgan over the head with an iron bolt wrapped in a handkerchief to subdue him. However, Morgan would not suffer any serious injury from this. The bolt just wasn't heavy enough. In fact, he would put up a pretty good fight with Dillinger, even slapping the young man's pistol away, causing it to fire. As this sound would rouse the attention of nearby people from their houses, old Ed, who heard that gunshot, became spooked and sped away in the car, leaving Dillinger to fend for himself. But as for Dillinger, he decided it wasn't worth it and hightailed it out of there. though in a series of even more amateur hour events, he'd quickly implicate himself in the crime to locals in a bar nearby where he wouldn't shut up about the crime that they knew nothing about. The next day, he'd be arrested at his house. And now, here's the first real fork in Dillinger's road, one where, at least according to Dillinger and his family, the entire course of his life would change. Only no one knew then it would change history right along with it. John Sr. strongly urged his son to own up to the crime in the hopes the court would take mercy on him. After all, Dillinger had no major criminal record yet. The Navy hadn't yet caught up to him over going AWOL, and he'd done no actual jail time before. After all, no one got away with any money from this. Easy to think it'd be a slap on the wrist. And John Sr. no doubt thought a little jail time would be the thing to finally help his troubled son make a fresh start in life. A good old round of scared straight, if you will. Johnny did heed his father's advice, something he would regret for the rest of his life. In this confession, he also implicated Ed Singleton, who was also arrested. But the judge was not in the mood to deal out any mercy that day. Maybe it was because the locals he was elected to serve were enraged at the crime perpetrated on a respected elderly man. Maybe he could just smell Dillinger's antisocial nature wafting off of him and knew this would only be the start of more crimes to come. The judge would later say he had no choice but to give the appropriate sentence for the crimes to which Dillinger confessed: conspiracy to commit a robbery and assault with intent to rob. And that meant 2 sentences of 2 to 14 years and 10 to 20 years. These were to be served concurrently, however, which was the only silver lining in the very dark clouds now hanging over Dillinger's future. One way or the other, he was in for at least a decade in prison. Meanwhile, Ed Singleton, who had a less naive view of the criminal justice system, had the sense to hire a lawyer. He stood trial, and though he was found guilty, was sentenced 2 to 14 years. He ended up serving even less than the 2, however, due to good behavior. Moral of the story: always get a lawyer. Okay, maybe also don't rob people, but still. John Sr. immediately regretted the advice he gave his son and tried to reason with the judge on the harsh sentence, but to no avail. He would later say he'd even heard the local prosecutor had so lacked evidence that he probably would have dropped the charges altogether had the 2 not confessed. But that's neither here nor there. Dillinger would reportedly try to escape custody while being escorted to the Indiana State Reformatory in Pendleton, an institution for youths under the age of 21, which Dillinger just barely managed to skirt by. And over the first year or so of his imprisonment, he would make 2 more escape attempts, each one adding 6 months to his sentence and only infuriating him more. He didn't quite understand the whole good behavior leading to an early release thing. Adding to this fury was the fact that Dillinger was diagnosed with gonorrhea when he was admitted, which required extremely painful treatments at the time. The kind that involve needles inserted into the urethra. Ouch. Thank God for modern day antibiotics, right? Dillinger would eventually settle into a routine, though, when he took up work in the prison's shirt factory, one of many civilian-owned businesses that operated within the prison walls for that sweet, sweet, cheap prison labor. He wrote home frequently, and his family and wife visited fairly often. He also joined the prison baseball team. Here and there, he would get into more behavioral spats, but for the most part, he began to mellow out a little and learn the ways of the much more confined world in which he now lived. Unfortunately, Dillinger's easy prison time wasn't to last. In 1929, after she avoided making visits and ducked his letters, Beryl Hovius Dillinger filed for divorce, no doubt growing tired of wasting her youth on waiting for a husband who, even before being shipped off to the pen, had been far from a decent spouse. After this, John saw little reward in returning home to Mooresville at the end of his sentence, and at 26 was probably tired of serving his time with a bunch of kids. He put in for a transfer up to the prison in Michigan City, claiming he wanted to play for their better baseball team, and they obliged. Though he was warned this time might be harder up there with the big boys, many of whom were closer to his father's age. The rules were stricter up there too, but John took up work in the shirt factory again, and he ended up being too depressed to play baseball. And perhaps too busy, because he quickly made friends with some fellas whose names you'll be hearing a good bit throughout this series, among them Harry Pierpont and Homer Van Meter. He also met some guys who were associated with a German-American bank robber named Herman Lamb, nicknamed the Baron. Really quick, I want to do a side tangent on Lamb because although the two men never met, Lamb would become a very important figure in shaping Dillinger's future. His fingerprints can in fact be found all over history and popular culture when you peer closely enough, especially when you watch a standard issue heist movie. In fact, Lamb is considered the father of modern bank robbery by those who've written extensively about him. While in Germany, Lamb was a soldier in the Prussian army, though he was fired from his regiment after being caught cheating at cards. I had no idea that such an offense could lead to being expelled from the military, but anyway, he came over to the United States in 1914, just before the outbreak of World War I, and it wasn't long before he started holding up banks. Even then, Lamb was intent on using his military knowledge to execute his heists more methodically. He understood that improvisation in such scenarios was the first ticket to being caught or killed. But in 1917, he wound up being arrested after a failed bank robbery landed him in a Utah prison for a bit. It was there he would devise what became known as the Lamb technique for robbing banks. It all started with casing the joint. By the way, the word case used in this context, meaning to closely observe, sprung into use right around this time and has sometimes been credited to Lamb, though I could find no direct evidence of that. It does seem to have originated around a particular gambling game that was popular back in 1915. Anyway, Lamb's technique involved having a team, each of them with a specific role, much like a military operation. You had your lookout, you had your getaway driver, the lobby man, and of course the vault man. Weeks before Lamb executed a robbery, he and his team would spend a good bit of time visiting the bank and drawing up detailed floor plans, including the location of the vaults and all entry and egress points. He was also known to send someone disguised as a journalist to ask questions and take additional notes. Lamb would then build a full-scale mock-up of the bank and rehearse the drill multiple times using stopwatches until they got it right. He applied the same methodology to the getaways. Lamb sourced fast, powerful vehicles with V8 engines, stocked with extra gasoline cans and medical kits to treat any injuries, and he hired drivers who had auto racing experience to be his wheelmen. He spent a lot of time mapping all the back roads and alternate routes, drawing up maps and speedometer readings to paste on the dashboards. Then he and the driver would make multiple runs in various weather conditions, again, just to make sure they had it all down. And this all paid off in a big way for Lamb's gang. They pulled dozens of successful bank robberies over a decade and a half and were considered the masters of the craft, such as it was. The method wasn't foolproof, though. Lamb's luck ran dry in December of 1930 following a botched getaway in Clinton, Indiana, which, what is it about Indiana and bank robbers anyway? Forced to seize multiple vehicles after they all suffered mechanical failures of one variety or another, Lamb and his team were facing down 200 cops and armed citizen vigilantes. In the ensuing gun battle, W.H. Hunter, who was Lamb's main partner and a former rum runner, that was somebody who used to run bootlegged liquor back and forth, well, he was shot dead. Feeling cornered and unwilling to be taken alive, Lamb turned his gun on himself. Two of his teammates, Walter Dietrich and James Oklahoma Jack Clark, ended up sentenced to life in the Indiana Penitentiary in Michigan City, where they would meet our man of the hour, John Dillinger. In exchange for admittance into Dillinger's gang, they taught John everything they knew about Lamb's technique. But again, Dillinger's problems didn't really begin or end at his method of operation. It was his greed, not only for the money, but for the thrill. Maybe if he'd only done it once or twice, he would have lived to tell his tale as an old man. But like any line of work, money runs out quickly, and when you're living the fast and hot lifestyle of a gangster, even more so. Also, in a criminal's mind, robbing one bank is like eating one potato chip. You will definitely want more. Soon, you begin to feel invincible. Hell, Lamb had more right than most to feel that way. While he did have a few run-ins with the law prior to that final shootout, he managed to avoid serious prison time and made himself a millionaire. Why settle for 10 grand from one measly score when you can taste 10 times that just waiting for you? And you have a skilled team at your disposal. So back to Dillinger. It's now 1933, and he's still in prison, right? Not for long. After serving 9 years of a minimum 10-year sentence, he was granted parole on May 10th, about 10 weeks shy of his 30th birthday. Dillinger's family actually had a lot to do with this slightly early release. John Sr. started a public petition and managed to get a couple hundred signatures, including that of Dillinger's victim, old Frank Morgan. He also appealed to the parole board directly, claiming he needed his son's assistance on the farm during the hard economic times. And that's another thing to keep in mind. Dillinger went to prison at the height of the Roaring Twenties, a world of plenty. During his decade away, the world had become a much more difficult place to live, and he'd largely been sheltered from that within the prison walls. After some time for Dillinger's case to work its way through the clemency board, his release was ultimately approved by 2 of the 3 board members, and that was enough. Let me take another second here just to say that in reading about John Sr. and all of this and the rest of this family, I can't help but feel a lot of sympathy for them. Despite any imperfections, Sr. clearly loved his son and really wanted to help him. But John, despite some of his good qualities, was born immune to the effects of authority, and there probably wasn't much anyone could have done to save him. And after spending his whole young adult life behind bars, John emerged an angry and embittered man, ready to get down to the business of professional bank robbery. A giant middle finger to the establishment that he felt had denied him of any opportunity to prosper the old-fashioned way. Not that he was trying very hard to do that before he went to prison, but anyway. He also devised a plan to get his friends, Harry Pierpont and 9 others, out of prison by having Pierpont's girlfriend help smuggle guns into the prison for the guys. And that was after Dillinger's attempts to bribe certain parole officials to help Pierpont help aid his release with the parole board. Well, that ended up falling through. But at that point, John got work he got to work doing what he'd been training the last 9 years of his life for. He hit the commercial bank in Daleville, Indiana for $3,500 on July 17th. And that's where he'd earned the nickname the Jackrabbit for his acrobatic skill of hopping over the gates separating the lobby from the teller area. That ended up becoming a bit of a trademark of his. Next, on August 4th, he robbed Montpelier National Bank in Montpelier, Indiana for $6,700. Then he took on Bluffton Bank in Bluffton, Ohio for $6,000 on August 14th. And on September 6th, 1933, he hit the Massachusetts Avenue State Bank in Indianapolis for a cool 21 grand. And those are the only hits that have been officially verified at that time. There were a lot of other suspected ones. And then in late September, he would be arrested by police in Dayton, Ohio. Hey, hometown shout out. And then he'd be hauled up to the Allen County Jail in Lima, about 70 miles north of here, for processing. That was after he was laid up here in Montgomery County Jail for a couple months. Well, not a couple months, more like a few weeks, but anyway. Now, not all of you are familiar with the geography here, so in listening to everything I just mentioned about the bank robberies in Indiana, the last of which was in Indianapolis, you might be wondering how cops from a city 2 hours away in another state managed to arrest Dillinger. I mean, yes, he did rob a couple banks in Ohio, too. There was another one in the city of New Carlisle, which is about 20 miles northeast of the city, though I should note that there are some discrepancies in this robbery, and it's not on all the official tallies because the suspects were apparently masked, and that wasn't part of Dillinger's known MO, even if he might have been, trying out different techniques to see what would work that early in his career. But anyway. And of course, there was the Bluffton robbery, which is near Lima. That's a couple hours away. At any rate, we do know he was wanted in Ohio, so that's understandable. But in all of the main online sources I've been using for this, nearly all of them gloss over this whole bit of how he came to be arrested in Dayton. Was he planning a job here? I mean, that seems pretty reasonable. But all the articles were just like, he was tracked by Dayton police, arrested, and sent to Lima. Okay. But I happen to live in Dayton, so I was particularly curious about this detail, and places like Wikipedia, PBS, and the FBI's own website weren't coughing up the goods. So I went and did a little more digging on newspapers.com and found that when Dillinger was locked up in the Indiana pen, he made friends with a fellow inmate, convicted murderer James Jenkins. And old Jim, well, he had a sister in Dayton named Mary Jenkins Loneker. It's because she was married, but I'll get to that in a second. Jim must have shared enough details about the young woman to entice Dillinger because apart from sticking up banks and grocery stores and other places when he got out of prison, he plainly wanted to hook up with this pretty 22-year-old brunette. According to the Dayton Daily News, Dillinger headed down to Dayton and tried to track Mary down at the boarding house on West 1st Street, on the outskirts of downtown where she was living at the time, even asking people on the street nearby as he drove along in a Model A Ford where she was. Well, she was out of town at the time, so he got a room at the same boarding house and waited for her to show up. And I guess Mary was willing to buy whatever Dillinger sold because that would become the first of 7 or 8 trips Dillinger would make to Dayton to call on his new lover. He would even take Mary up to the Chicago World's Fair on a 10-day whirlwind trip between his various robberies. And they dreamed of breaking her brother Jim out of prison and all of them moving away together. There was another wrinkle in all this, though. As I said before, Mary had herself a husband. She also had a couple of kids, though apparently the relationship had been on the outs for some time and Mary was out of contact with those kids. That probably explains why she was living in that boarding house while the family lived in Pleasant Hill, about a half hour away. No worries, though. Dillinger, smitten with Mary, he was prepared to pay for her divorce, too, even hired the lawyer to get it done. It seemed like things were heating up for real with these two crazy kids, and Mary knew all about John's robbery exploits, too, and she was still all in. In fact, she was so all in that she started telling her landlady, Lucille Stricker, all about her new beau. Well, Lucille, she wasn't into having that kind of riffraff milling around her boarding house, so she informed the police. For about 7 weeks, detectives staked out the boarding house while Lucille intercepted Mary's mail, steaming open letters Dillinger had sent her while he was out on his various exploits. And by the way, for their part, Indiana police were also intercepting any mail being sent to Dillinger, which let them know that he was spending time in Dayton as well. The police were also receiving help from members of the Pinkerton Detective Agency, who'd been hired by the bank in Bluffton following that robbery in August. Only problem was, Dillinger wasn't showing up at the boarding house. He was being a very busy bee, but worry not. I'll fill in a lot of those blanks for you in the next episodes. On September 22nd, just as police were about to give up for good, they received a call from Lucille Stricker at around 1 a.m. Dillinger had just arrived at the boarding house. Police quickly showed up and arrested him while he was sifting through the photos he and Mary took at the Chicago World's Fair. In the process of searching his room, they found all kinds of money, guns, and ammo. They also found a bag of carpet tacks. A curious enough detail, but it made complete sense. What better way to pop the tires of the police cars pursuing you on your getaway? Roofing nails were also commonly used for this purpose. They really did think of everything, didn't they? Except it would seem the potential for a lover to run her mouth to the wrong folks. When police confronted Dillinger, he had a .38 pistol up his sleeve, but staring down the barrel of a much more frightening Tommy gun, he knew he'd be shot dead if he went for it. That gun was confiscated along with the rest of Dillinger's loot, and it's still in the possession of the Carillon Historical Park here in town. In fact, the Dayton police chief, Rudolph Wurstner, kept the gun until his death and actually used it as his sidearm until 1945, I should say. Police found another interesting item in Dillinger's possession, papers containing details of what looked like a planned prison break. But he betrayed no further information on that or anything else. He simply donned that characteristic crooked grin of his and told them to get his lawyer. And it would so happen just 4 days following Dillinger's capture, 8 of his inmate friends from Michigan City, the shirt factory, all of whom would come to make up the Dillinger gang, made their escape using their smuggled shotguns and rifles and shooting a couple prison guards in the process. They would eventually make their way to Ohio to get their leader out of the clink. And after their failed attempt to disguise themselves as Indiana officials extraditing Dillinger back to prison, Harry Pierpont opened fire on Sheriff Jess Sarber, shooting him in the gut. And then, for extra measure, he would severely pistol whip the man. He would later die as a result of the head injury. They also locked up Sarber's wife and another deputy in a cell. Dillinger was reportedly unhappy about the unnecessary brutality used on the affable Sheriff Sarber, but Pierpont was known to fly off into violent rages, and it wouldn't be the last time something like this happened in their time together. The group, soon to be branded by the police and the media as the Terror Gang, would actually, before heading back to Indiana, hole up in a hideout about 120 miles away in Hamilton, Ohio, just north of Cincinnati. Another place I have a deep connection to, by the way, seeing as my father grew up there and much of my family still lives in and around those parts, including my grandma. Dillinger had a whole lot more mayhem in store over the course of the months to come. And next week, I'm going to dig even deeper into it, as well as some of the other big players, both on the law enforcement side and the gang side, including the woman that would become the love of Dillinger's life. If you like this episode, I'd love to hear from you. Email me at vintagevillainspod@gmail.com or join the Vintage Villains Soiree Facebook group and start a discussion. Big thanks to my supporters on Patreon who enjoy early episodes and other exclusives. Now get out there and make good history, and I'll see you next time in another century.